Hey, what's up, guys? Jackson here. Jax Labs, currently in my messy room once again. I'm going to talk to you about the current AI bubble, what's going to happen, what happened prior, why things worked, what I'm doing, and everything in between. So I'm going to get right into it. The current state of the bubble, if you want to talk about it that way, is that in the idea of AI is that people don't really understand how to use AI. What they just know that they want to be a part of the next wave, right? If you look at every era and what was the supporting components that made it work and thrive, it's always like 40%, they say, of anything that seems to work at the level of the mountains that are industries is about timing. And the reason why it's about timing is because it's about the psychological and sociological effects of the current state of people. So, in particular, about how, like, the Industrial Revolution in the early 20th century was on the back of the 19th century, which a lot had happened in that century. The British had their heyday in the early 19th century, and they were the empire at the time. They had theirs about 1812 to 18 fill in the blank, and they were copying the Dutch, essentially. The Dutch, excuse the noise, my window's open, but they were copying the Dutch, more or less. The Dutch were the empire around the 1600s, and they were the first to establish a lot of the how empires reign even today. Like they established fleet ships for a larger way of a trade and bartering and tools, and they made windmills and clocks and all these things, and the advancement of the Dutch guilder made them the empire because they were a world reserve currency, and they utilized that to make the Dutch India Company, and they had their in Amsterdam um, they had their World Trade Center, essentially. And because the Gilder was used in every location, that allowed them to trade with multiple countries. But the countries were still foundational a lot of times. I mean, 1642 was when the Europeans came over to further west to the American states and started building the colonies and whatnot. And so there already were plans in advance, but they really hadn't had the model down. And then they were using cheap, or if not forced labor, to build, talking about the Dutch, right? To build their infrastructure. And then the British were watching that for a while, and they thought we can get even cheaper labor, do the same things, and make our infrastructure. And they did that, and they had their heyday. All those Jane Austen movies you watch and books you read, and the Pride and Prejudice, that was sort of either building up or in their heyday when there was a lot of wealth. And then the Americas, by the way, didn't even though the Americas were established for a long time, they didn't really have their heyday until the 40s. And that was right after World War II, and the Dutch pound had sort of collapsed due to the many expensive, wars are very costly, and they were breaking the value of the pound. And it wasn't until the 40s when America and the Allies won World War II that they had that big meeting with Churchill and Stalin and all these guys with Truman, and they effectively are like, we're the new empire, sort of thing, We speaking for them as America. And that's when you follow the American dream and all these other things. But why was that possible, right? So the Industrial Revolution fortified that because they had the ability to fast produce anything really, but they were working still with pretty crude materials, very strong metals, and they hadn't yet had the need to establish their foothold in other countries. So much of what their foothold in other countries come from the need of rare metals that are utilized in these processes that these industrial sort of complexes thrive on. And so they'll go to these countries, force their way um, in one way or another, or come to an agreement, and get these metals and these rare materials for their industrial establishment. But that wasn't really until after Standard Oil and Carnegie and the steel production got to its height, and they were like, okay, we need to speed up the transportation of materials, of individuals, because everything was like horse and carriage essentially, and they had really no sort of automated way. The reason I'm talking about this is because this began the wave of automation. We're still in that wave. Everything is about speed and building and sort of consolidating energy and powers. And the empires for the last however many thousands of years, 4,000 years really, would collapse due to the lack of information being able to be widespread. Information took too long to get to the needed sources, and you have to kind of go the long way around it to make that work. With the assembly line, you have cars, and cars transport people, and excuse me, and trains and the railroad stations and all these things were able to transport goods to further establish the foothold that is the current the country. And the timing of that allowed for, when there was the first two world wars, they had the ability to manufacture the needed materials and properties to engage in that war at that level. And it also gave them a bit of a leg up in that way. And then what does that imbue? The idea that we need to prioritize the workers, because the workers are the ones that, even though that we now have created something stronger than humans for the first time with these industrial machines, we have assembly lines now. We need workers to push out this stuff, and so that there was still a strong need for the human element, because we had ingenuity and we work together, and so also because because of this establishing, you can have establishments now that function as monopolies and expand and have all these things, and they utilize this as an opportunity to sort of build a foothold with commerce, and capitalism can thrive for the first time. And then you have J.P. Morgan, and his money is growing and in the banking system and all these things. And so all this begins to expand sort of what is the economy. And this continues to then build upon the fact that after the Great Depression, they sort of saw how they were doing things wrong in some aspects, because the banking systems a lot of it's based on just the system itself, based on faith. So it's like, it daisy chains itself in a loop of agreements that hold up the infrastructure, but there's nothing really holding it up besides the fact the structure itself, which is a problem, and it hasn't really gone away, by the way. And that bubble itself will pop, but it takes longer because it's the infrastructure as a whole, and they're trying to stop that. But they're gonna manufacture a change to that themselves. Neither here nor there. So walking down the lane, after World War II, they've sort of got their foothold, and then they have more money, so they're building up the community aspect. So that's why I said the workers are prioritized, and they have, the 50s was all about the American dream. You go to school, get a job. We'll know where you are all the times because you're there at those locations. You can make enough to have a family, all these things, and there was no one's really worried about information because you have just enough to manufacture and facilitate a lifestyle that is keeps you preoccupied and satisfied, more or less. But obviously, because I could get into like the social applications of the fact that there's different groups of nationality, which means different groups of culture, which means different groups of distribution and all these things. So that created a lot of tension socially that was established in the 60s and the late 60s. Really felt the impact of that, which then changes the narrative, because it's like, okay, we can't do this exact model across the board. We have to have different levels of it, and we can't also keep you disillusioned in the idea of joy if you don't have a certain level of wealth that can rise above it. And so they're now and this is not all of the elements, but this is a big element that pushes the narrative towards how do we keep them more focused on to keep them working. So they start pushing the idea of luxury, which is where you get the capitalism really begins to become established in the 80s. And by the 80s, you have so much more technology growing in the consumer level. So you have, computers are coming around, in 1977, Apple was just kicked off. IBM was around, but it was more for commercial basis, whereas, for companies and whatnot. And at the personalized computer level, there was Apple comes along and tries to introduce ingenuity, and at the level of status and luxury and usefulness, right? And so we see a big swing in all these things, and then you start to expand that across the board. So you create something that can have utility across multiple concepts and domains, right? And this is why this matters for AI, right? So Apple is a big staple in this. Microsoft had a big hand because they also sort of removed a moat between software, but because Apple was a lot more restrictive as to what they're doing behind the scenes. They just want to present the product to you, which is fine. But aspects of what Microsoft was doing was to open the door for various ways of technological usage, which is why Apple computers are more for luxury and, the fluidity of appearance and like, I'm not going to use a MacBook to code something primarily unless it's focused on Mac. Like, their whole infrastructure, which was smart because it created a way to have everyone funnel through your avenue, for lack of better words. The same way with Standard Oil, they forced everyone to use their own manufacturers. They own both sides of the end point, so you have no way to get around it. In the idea of how monopoly functions as a concept, and even though you might not be able to have that in a conglomerate as a company, even though we kind of do, you can conceptually manufacture that. And so, but you have to have the timing of what does the people want, what do the people need, and what don't they realize. The ambiguity allows you to sort of create a foothold, because there's no opinion, there's no direction. The direction is emotional, it's in the abstract, and so you can establish a foothold somewhere that's in the heart of these three pieces: the need, the want, and the ambiguity, based on, and that structure, that triangulated structure, is sitting on top of the, which are all affected by timing, but it's sitting on top of where in the timeline are you right now, in ideas of industrialness, but more importantly sociologically. What's the next step that's going to come, and how do you pivot where you are into that and strain it through all those pieces, right? And so, anyway, the 90s, right? We have the dot-com bubble, and the dot-com bubble was this new concept of the internet, and information will travel faster, which was made possible from all these little incremental steps leading up over the last 50 years since the 40s. And the concepts that were established in the 80s and all these things. And people was like, we need our own avenues for commercialism and our own avenues for passing information. But then you have, it's the way, you had websites for every little insignificant idiosyncratic piece of information. You have, pieces of you have like websites that are like, Here's where you can find lamps. And we still have things like that, right? But they're not like things you think about or that you channel through. It's more of a necessity, right? Like going to Walmart or a convenience store. And even then, the only reason that these things work or thrive, which Amazon came and took, is that they became the superstore of technological, like, save time, get resources that are more commodity focused, things that you don't want to think about of like, let me find the right source. He's like, we are now the source for that. The same way Google became the search engine, right? So the internet flourished based on these companies flourished in the area of the internet because they created locations for the more conceptual, abstract piece of, I just need to get from A to B in here, and what source do I trust to go through for that? Google is a search engine, which is a structural sort of foundational piece, right? You commoditize, if I'm saying that correctly, that need through your channel. Amazon's done it. Apple, to this day, since the early 2000s, had a great pivot with iOS, realizing that we need to focus less on the hardware of here you go, and more on the concept, right? And this is where they established things like iOS, and what they established, the reason, I don't have the numbers on this, but I would strongly bet that the reasons why they function so well as with conversion rates and in maintaining conversion is the social aspect of the text messages. They have the blue bubble and the green bubble. If you don't have the blue bubble, you're not in the code. You're not in the club. Sorry, so is what I meant. And people don't even want to talk to you. I bet the social shame they implicate onto another person. That I've done it. I have Apple. I've kept Apple for that reason. Because you could make a case for, technologically speaking, which one's more makes sense on paper. Android maybe has a lot more to offer, in little pieces and idiosyncratic, like, little avenues, but Apple has the social aspect, and the social aspect is the direct driver of what main thing. We have the desire to socialize because we're social creatures, but more importantly, it's about status. And what is status a symbol of? The ability to mate. It's not the ability as much as it is the call sign. It's like I'm socially adept because I'm in this club, and because of the pricing of it, it now signals I am competent monetarily, and I also am aware of the spectrum of what is valuable, and it's lost some of that because now you don't really need to lean on that as much as it just becomes the desire to not hop off of that train. And it has a sleek design, and they were the first to remove the touchscreens. Steve Jobs knew that. How can I reduce the amount of things? Before, the phones were utility, and now phones became status in a way outside of the box. Like IBM, once again, was utility for commercial values, the same way BlackBerries were. And then Apple comes along and presents the idea of, hey, you can have utility and status, and I can consolidate all these things you need. You have a camera, you can call and text, obviously, but now this is so much more. You can go on the internet, you can listen to music, you can do this, you can do that. And that blew our minds. We're like, oh my God, I never had a thing where this becomes an extension of me, because everything that I want and need and connect with are all in this location. How Google did it, how Amazon did it, and now the iPhone represents that as well. And so now we're in the position of AI. And we also have to understand the climate, right? When Apple released the iPhone or whatever, it was mid 2000s, like 2008, 2009, almost 2010. And at that time, we had the housing market was about to burst. But believe it or not, that seemed to not impact this. Because, 2007, like I think the Apple phone 1 came out or whatever, right? And people were making a lot of money. There was like a moment where they were really here just before the here. YouTube comes out 2006. Like there was a stretch between like 05 and 07 before all of that came crashing down monetarily with, banking system, all these things. But people were like, we're moving forward. And a lot of that was perpetuated because in the 90s, the internet gave us this Y2K era of like, oh, we are in the future. Like we were pining for the future. If you look at every like Fruitigo Arrow and look at these different types of like sort of texture based designs and what was the social and sociological implications behind it. It's the idea that we are advancing beyond these primitive means and we're automating everything. Information is automated. You know, we're going to have robots, and we were kind of jumping ahead 20 years. As we see, we actually have AI and robots now, and we're like, ooh, let's go back. You know, everyone's looking back now. They want to go back to the old values prior to this that forces us to communicate with one another instead of having to communicate through technology. And that piece is lost, you know, because everything is automated, even the things that are meant to be personal and you could feel it, you know. And now even dating, like you have dating apps to just automate, you know, the need for connection, you know, and you can automate your food, comes right to your door. So it's like, because there's nothing that we have to focus on in terms of building or doing, we're so, you know, we're over, you know, structured, over commoditized, and it makes us feel hollow. And the feeling that Y2K era had after you start to realize that it was all a sham, you start looking around and you start being like, you know what, like after a while, these very sleek sort of like pastel colored designs and very round like ambient glowing structures start to fade, and they start to get a bit, you know, dingy, and you're just like, like this is sort of bursting my illusion. And we didn't even really have the technology to automate those kind of concepts to make them real the way we thought like cyberpunk looks, you know, and how they actually have those abilities to do that. So we were trying to, you know, Star Wars too in the 70s made it seem like, oh, this is the future, you know. And it was like all these things were so much focused on like, you know, microchips and all these whatever, like technology aids, you know, like this is the future. And now we're actually in the future and we hate it. It's, you know, it's interesting. Because we just use it to satisfy those primitive desires. When you can just go right to the source, to be honest. Anywho, AI is the maximizing of information and personalization with, I could take this aspect of what do we have leverage on as a human, our minds. We have consciousness, we have ingenuity, we have the ability to think abstractly and to build and formulate ideas and to create worlds, right? And AI is now tapping into that. So we're creating an industrial version of the brain and the mind. And that's where the disconnect will grow and has grown. And that's why there's a lot of fear around it, right? But how do you do what Apple and Google with General Mills and all these guys did, right? Is OpenAI that source? No. OpenAI is the opening up of what's possible when the internet was introduced. You know, it opens that idea. But they're not, like, is Google the source or is Amazon? You know, even though they both serve a purpose in that aspect, they're just showing what's possible. You can communicate with it. Well, how do you get to the next level? How do you fulfill that desire we have to reconnect with each other at a level that doesn't feel placid, that doesn't feel manufactured, but feels authentic? We're craving authenticity because everything is manufactured, and authenticity comes from something that's natural and that is a part of you, that isn't just pattern recognition or something like that, you know. And so is the answer, hey, let me give you something else to automate the way AI is trying to do? Or is the answer, hey, let me let you express yourself in a way that allows me to come into your world and to really connect with you and understand you better, and we can rebuild empathy in a way that we've never known. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do and what I will do is two things. One, you feel powerless in the world, right? You feel powerless because you've given away your power, essentially, with all these things you've created. So you make it serve you in the sense that you sort of make it an extension of yourself. The iPhone is an extension of yourself. It doesn't compete with you. You have it and you're like, this is my phone. You choose it. You even have the colors to make it more personal. All these things, you've put your, you know, like your little file cabinet into your phone, so to speak. And you got your music there, and you can connect with it emotionally. So how do you do that with AI? How do you make AI an extension of the self? OpenAI has done it with people being able to open up and communicate and have that sort of sound back and forth, you could say. But that's not enough, right? We need to create a fundamental and non-threatening way to establish that. First thing you want to do is that, based on the current climate of people's feelings, is that they kind of feel their privatization is stolen from them, and they feel that they have no power. So what you do is you give them back that using the same thing. You got to use that to reclaim it. Otherwise, it won't satisfy it won't satisfy the fear. It won't satisfy the desire. So you have to use AI to do that. I'm making products that will give people the privacy back because it protects them against AI and quantum, things like that, by using it against that. They can wield it. They don't feel like they are at the mercy of it, And so I do that by alleviating the need for hardware. So you don't have to buy a bunch of stuff. You don't have to really know anything. If you download this thing, it's protecting you. So that is a shield, a moat, so to speak, between you and the things that are trying to destroy you. And then you give them the ability to build from there. So it's like not just writing code with AI, like asking it for code, but telling it, hey, manufacture this piece of me, this world. And that's where I want to pivot into RealityNet, where I'm giving you tools that protect you. I'm giving you tools that accelerate what you need to do so that you can obviously not think about the timing, which is still the same thing. You're speeding up. That's an automation of facts. But you're doing it in a way that makes it so that you can intimately understand and build your own world within a world, and not for the sake of isolation, but for the sake of presenting who you are in a way that maybe even you don't even know. And that individuality is not for the sake of hyper-individuation, but for the sake of expression, which is for the sake of communication. Because why would you express something to no one? And I think we can achieve that. That's what I'm trying to do right now, and what I'm building with these devices and whatnot. And then you alleviate the need. When you alleviate the need for energy, so it doesn't need hardware, it doesn't need a ton of energy to do these things, then you don't make it, you remove the moat that comes from the price, that comes from needing locations, and everything you already have becomes enough to establish this, And it's like, let's take away the luxury of products in this way, and make the luxury the expression. It's not the art materials I'm using. It's who am I, and how am I trying to convey that. And so, with the products that I'm making with RealityNet, you'll be able to tell it, hey, make a movie about this and this and this and that, and all these pieces, and it would be able to do that. And at first, that seems scary because you think, what about the expression? What about the workers? It's like, well, we all collaborated to do that. You can still collaborate, but instead of needing $100,000 in a loan and $1 million to make a movie or this or that, and needing the energy to do that, you could do that naturally. And you can still monetize that based on the creativity. You're monetizing how good am I at thinking and expressing myself. And people will use that aspect of it, entertainment, as a way of connecting with the artist. And you could do that with tools as well. You could create tools that make better things for other people. You could use RealityNet to quite literally simulate reality for yourself. And what would this look like if this was the result? How would this look if this was the result? How would this look if I put these two factors together? And you could have information there. You could even solve medical problems. You could do anything you want, really, that removes constraints that are forced upon us that we thought we couldn't get around. That's my intention, really, and what I've been achieving so far. And the math I'm using to achieve that has made it possible because it's a universal math. These are universal principles, and instead of us spending all our time guessing and wondering, we spend our time looking inward. And I think that's what we all really need to do. So I hope to be a conduit for that, aka the name of my site, Quantum Conduit. I think that's all I want to say. It's been a 30-minute video. Thanks for watching. These things will become a reality really soon. So keep your eyes open.